Mavis Gallant, the famed short story writer, lived the majority of her life in a small Paris apartment typing out her stories. She would send these stories off to be published in The New Yorker, and later they would be turned into acclaimed collections. Listen, I could sit here all day and list her accomplishments and awards, which there are many, but just know that she received plenty of well-deserved recognition before she died in 2014 at the age of 91. What I find most fascinating about Gallant was her unwavering determination to be a writer despite being a woman in the 1950s. Because Gallant is widely associated with Paris, it took Montrealers a while to acknowledge her as one of their own. But the truth is, her story begins in Montreal. Mavis Leslie de Trafford Young was born in Montreal in August of 1922. She was a Leo, so fans of astrology won't be surprised to know that her story is one of self-confidence and ambition. As a child, Mavis Gallant was ignored by the adults in her life. She had the sort of parents that are often found in children's books, the ones that send them off to live with relatives or to boarding schools. At 4 years old, she was sent to a French Catholic boarding school, where she was the only Anglophone Protestant. What was strange about this was that the school was right down the street from where she lived on Sherbrooke in front of McGill. So why was she boarded so close to home? Well, that's a question she never got the answer to. Gallant said her mother just dropped her off at boarding school and told her she'd be back soon and didn't return. And when her father died, her mother abandoned her. She remarried and left 10-year-old Mavis with a guardian in the city. She didn't even find out her dad had passed until 3 years later from a family friend. When asked later in life how it affected her, Gallant put it simply, that children adapt quicker than you think. I can picture her shrugging as she says this. Despite her unsettled childhood, there was one constant companion in her life. Books. Gallant was a child who read anything she could get her hands on, and like many unhappy children, found her people in books. Do ignored children end up developing a strong and unique sense of self? Perhaps. She studied at 17 different schools in her youth. This exposed her to so many different types of people at a young age, which would go on to influence her writing, as she was known for her well-developed characters. She would create young women who were transitory and who had to fend for themselves in foreign cities filled with charming and dubious strangers. So, we've established that she was an independent child, and this did not change as she grew up. She became the most impressive young woman. In 1940, at 18, she returned to Montreal from New York City to look for work. But for the first half of the 20th century, jobs available for women were limited. It was acceptable to be a servant, a teacher, a seamstress, a housekeeper, or a saleswoman. There was also a strong sentiment that married women should not be working outside the home. Men feared that the cheap labor women were providing would undercut their wages. And they were also concerned that work would impair femininity and distract them from being wives and mothers. In Gallant's case, it did exactly that. She wanted to be a writer, practically unheard of, but she did arrive in Montreal during a transitional period for women in Quebec. World War II was on, and there were suddenly temporary positions available to women, and Gallant wanted to secure one of those positions. With this in mind, she tried to get a job at the popular newspaper, the Montreal Standard. But not only did they not take people with no experience, they rarely took women. And according to her, she was not taken seriously upon her first interview, where she was interviewed standing in a corridor. Then, after much persistence, she was hired on a temporary contract and went on to work there for 6 years. One of her most notable interviews was with Jean-Paul Sartre. She said she was the only woman at the press conference that day, and that she stood in front wearing her signature red coat in order to be noticed. And it must have succeeded because she got her iconic one-on-one interview. She once said, "I loved journalism. I never looked at it as a waste of time. What I liked about it was having a lot of freedom." For her, freedom was always the goal. Gallant had a brief, unsuccessful marriage in her early 20s. After her divorce, she left all traces of her domestic life behind her in Montreal. Except, of course, she decided to keep her ex-husband's rather distinguished last name, Gallant. Can you blame her? It suits her perfectly. In 1950, at the age of 28, she moved to Paris, where she would spend the rest of her life unmarried and childless. Honestly, fighting off the pressures of being a wife and mother in the 50s is an accomplishment in itself. Her output of short stories and novels began to flourish. Around the time she arrived in Paris, she sold her first short story to The New Yorker. And she would go on to publish with them for the next 50 years, writing over 100 stories. Her writings reflect her life choices. Her stories have been described as unromantic, yet surprisingly hilarious. In her story Potter, a poor Polish poet falls in love with an adorable young Canadian woman. He is always trying to get her to commit, but she enjoys living off the many different men she is having affairs with, and she tells him so. This is probably the most romance you'll get out of Gallant. According to her, The New Yorker would sometimes refuse her stories on moral grounds. For example, there was one story where a young girl sneaks out of her boarding school to go spend the night somewhere else. Too scandalous for them. Her editor would often say, well, maybe those things happen in Canada, but they do not happen here. Gallant also continued to write nonfiction. In 1968, a student and worker uprising erupted in Paris, and protests and riots spread across the country for 7 weeks. Mavis Gallant was on the front lines. Her observations were published in The New Yorker and later in a collection called Paris Notebooks. Gallant reported from the thick of things and wrote exactly how it felt to be there, amongst the sea of flag-waving students and the armies of workers bearing down on her. She found herself weeping, but not from sadness or fear, but from tear gas in the metro. Does this sound familiar? For fans of Wes Anderson, it might. His 2021 film, The French Dispatch, features a segment inspired by these journals, with Frances McDormand standing in for Mavis Gallant. We are introduced to the Gallant character at a dinner party. She is telling her hosts that she deliberately chose to have neither husband nor child, which she states are the two greatest deterrents to a woman's ability to write. That's my Mavis. Gallant's segment in the Wes Anderson film is in black and white. It isn't until the very end when we see Frances McDormand in color that you realize she's been wearing Gallant's iconic red coat and skirt the entire time. She stuck out in her own peculiar way. She was very elegant and well-mannered, yet her notebooks were filled with the absurdities of everyday life. The secret joys of random encounters, the sound of women laughing on train platforms, the need to pack a suitcase and leave one's home, the confusion of wartime, and the unexpected quiet of peace. From her early days in Montreal, Gallant decided to take care of herself since no one else did. Yet she had such a love for others and the world. I will leave you with one of my favorite Mavis Gallant quotes. All lives are interesting. No one's life is more interesting than another. For CBC, the Creator Network, I'm Arizona O'Neill.
Paris, t'as le palpitant à Notre-Dame, et l'amour c'est rue d'Amsterdam qu'on l'achète pour des picaillons, même à ce prix-là.